or as we realize that this is all essentially kind of a story that gives meaning to how everything unfolds, it gives us a great deal of benefit because we can recognize that if we don't like something about ourselves, our lives, our idea of subjective well-being, that we can modify that story. We change the story and we change how we perceive the world, how we experience the world. And so one of the things that we want to be asking ourselves is, if that's the case, what kind of world or what kind of story is worthy of my life? Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and I'm glad you joined us today. Today we're going to talk about worldviews and how the stories that we tell to make up that worldview give us the context that makes words have meaning. And so we want to look a little bit about how that plays out for ourselves and what that means for the bigger picture. I mentioned last week that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And the whole process is this very interesting conundrum where our brain is encased in this black box and it gets input from our senses in the form of electronic signals, and it has to try and make sense of what is going on in the world out there from those signals. And so our goal, or what we should be striving for, is that there's a greater coherence between, in a sense, this hallucination, this reconstruction of the world that's happening in our brains and what's actually out there. The more those cohere, then the better off we're going to be in terms of being able to actually navigate and get along within our world. Our brains, while they're going through this process of trying to make sense of the world, are pattern-seeking devices. They try to seek out patterns to understand how things function so that we can make predictions. And the more we can make those kind of predictions, the better off we're going to be in terms of survival. So one of the things that we need to understand at a kind of fundamental level is that, at least theoretically, our world is understandable. We might not be capable of understanding everything, but it's the idea that everything happens for a particular reason. There's a pattern, a way that things unfold, that the more we understand them, then the better off we're going to be able to work within our world and understand how to work in harmony with it. So this will be a key thing that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about our stories, when we're thinking about how our brains are trying to make sense of everything. It's putting it into this context of patterns. What we might think of in a modern context is like the laws of nature or the rules of physics, how these things all fit together, how they function, so that we can understand how to work with our world. So with this idea then, that there's these patterns that we seek to understand, and we find ways to put these essentially then into a story that gives meaning or makes sense out of how all these different pieces fit together. And so we call this, in a sense, kind of a meta-narrative, the big picture of how all these things fit together. Now, when we're talking about religion or philosophy, this is really trying to answer those big questions. Why am I here? What is this all about? What is life? So when we try to answer those kind of questions, we start to realize, or as we realize, that this is all essentially kind of a story that gives meaning to how everything unfolds. It gives us a great deal of benefit because we can recognize that if we don't like something about ourselves, our lives, our idea of subjective well-being, that we can modify that story. We change the story and we change how we perceive the world, how we experience the world. And so one of the things that we want to be asking ourselves is, if that's the case, what kind of world or what kind of story is worthy of my life, of me spending my time in it? So what we want to try and do here is create a contrast of showing an alternative worldview, a different way of looking at the world, probably from what you're used to, that'll help to bring to light more of the worldview that you currently live in. The challenge we have is that many times our world view isn't obvious because it's just all pervasive. We've grown up with it and it's all around us, and we don't always recognize that it's there. I have an interesting story I tell sometimes about how I had, I grew up with, I believe it was my dad's uncle, who had some kids, and then 20 years later had another set of kids, and they had names, but everybody grew, just ended up calling them baby boy and baby girl. And as they grew up, it kind of stuck. And so I ended up growing up with an uncle boy and an aunt girl. And this didn't seem odd at all until I got into high school and I mentioned that to somebody and they were like, what are you talking about, your uncle boy? And it was only at that point that I was able to see that, oh yeah, this is kind of odd. But I wasn't able to see that till it came into contrast with something else from somebody else's perspective. And so that's what we want to do today, is we want to try and provide an alternative context for looking at the world that might help bring into greater focus what it is that we're currently assuming about the world, that will then allow us to be more intentional about what that worldview looks like and what types of beliefs and knowledge we have and want to incorporate into that story for our lives and who we want to be as characters in that story. So when we're thinking about, again, the Daodejing, which we're going to be talking about here in just a moment, we need to understand that you can't simply take the words in Chinese, translate them into English, and suddenly they're just going to make sense. The problem is that the meaning of words is not actually in the word itself, but it's within the context that that word is found, whether it's the sentence and the paragraph, but ultimately even out to the whole culture. So to really understand what something means, we have to understand that whole perspective that gets kind of packaged up with that word. Language is inherently ambiguous. Even within English, I could take the word bug. What do I mean by that? Am I talking about an insect or a vehicle or a listening device or that something is bothering me? There's a lot of different ways that we can use that same word that in order to take away the ambiguity, to disambiguate it, we have to situate it within a context. How am I using it? And that will help to make sense of, out of all these possible meanings, which meaning actually makes sense. And so this is what we want to do now, is get a kind of a sense of the big picture, the big overall way of looking at things from a Taoist perspective, so that when we start to look at the text, we'll have some place to situate the words in order to understand what they mean. Now, I said that we're going to be looking at the Taoist worldview, but there's really no such thing as a single view that is the Taoist view. So I'm really focusing on more of the earliest stages of the time frame when the Daodejing originally was composed. And at that point, I would argue that it was in much more of a philosophical rather than a religious context. But this is the time frame and the area that I'm focusing on when I'm talking about this overall worldview. So we'll start with the idea of Tao. Obviously, Tao is very central to the idea of Taoism. And so what is that? It's at its core, it has to do with the way of things. Tao can be used in a very common way within classical Chinese and against much of the other philosophies out there. They would all talk about Tao of one kind or another. In its simplest way of speaking, we could say that it describes a way, like I could say the way to get to the store. And that's something that you could follow or not follow. And so some of the different philosophies would talk about a Tao, a way of being in the world, a way of for rulers to rule, that they're suggesting that you should follow. And then there was a possibility of following it or not following it. And so they're obviously advocating for that. What was unique with Taoism is that they said it's not simply a way that can be described that an individual could choose to follow or not, which is really focusing at more kind of the human level. they expanded out further to more of a cosmic level. So instead of being human-centric, it was more cosmic-centric. And in that sense, Tao had to do with the way of the universe. We might almost think about this in terms of like the laws of nature. And what becomes interesting there is that there isn't really any way to not follow it. And we'll explore this a little bit further next week, but just at a core level, when we're talking about Tao in the Taoist sense of things, we're talking about the ultimate way that everything, in a sense, behaves, or the rules that it follows, the way of things, the way they work. The slides are going to kind of present things as a bit layered, but we need to think about them as kind of understanding different aspects of kind of the same thing. So at the outer level, we have Tao as the way of things, and inside that now we're talking about this concept of absence. And absence is also contrast with this idea of presence. And these really overlap in a lot of different ways. So let me try to kind of break this down a little bit. So we have absence and presence. And the idea is that there's a constant flow back and forth between these two. One of the things that's kind of central to this idea is that there is no nothing. The thing that we might think of as nothing, like the space between me and the camera, we might say it's empty, that there's nothing there, but really there is, right? There's our atmosphere that we live in that's full of molecules, but even if we get deeper at more kind of a quantum level, at least within the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics, even space itself is quantized. It is a thing. You cannot be outside of space. We only exist within it, like a fish within water. And so there, in a certain sense, is always something between everything. Everything is actually connected in some way. So when we're thinking about absence, it's not that we're saying nothing, or sometimes it's translated as non-existence, but really what it is it's this idea of without form. It is a substance that is undifferentiated. And then when we're talking about presence, it is how that undifferentiated absence becomes differentiated into presence, or sometimes it's translated as being. And one of the ways that we might think about this then is with form. So we have this idea of going from without form to form and then going back again in this constant cycle. And within this, then, we have a couple of different ways that is talked about within the Taoist language. The absence is sometimes also referred to as qi, spelt Qi here in the slide. And this is another one of those words that's kind of hard to like really pin down. At its core, it has to do with breath or air or wind, and it's kind of like this animating energy that pervades everything. And so one of the things that's very interesting when they start talking about Tao, or they talk about absence in Chinese Wu, or when you're talking about this idea of qi, they almost feel like they're sometimes being used interchangeably. And it's, in a certain sense, it's kind of talking about different aspects of this single thing that is everything, that there are patterns to it, there are ways things happen, and there's this movement from undifferentiated to different, to having differentiation. This idea of going from without form to form and back again, and kind of this interesting energy that seems to pervade especially living things. And then once we get into the side of presence, or with form, one of the ways that it talks about these different, let's say, objects that become present is it'll refer to them as the 10,000 things. It's a very, I think, kind of colorful way of talking about that I really enjoy. So once we get into these then 10,000 things, there's another concept that comes into play, and this is yin-yang, which is very common through a lot of Chinese philosophy, not just Taoism, but it's especially important within Taoism, even though it's rarely mentioned within the the primary texts themselves, but it's kind of assumed behind the scenes as part of this concept that was very common at the time. And so with yin yang, it's not just that there's opposites, it's that they're kind of interdependent, co-evolving with each other. The idea is, like, if we wanted to talk about an attribute of something and say, like myself, am I tall or am I short? Well, that attribute only makes sense in relationship to something else. If there was nothing else in all of the universe except for myself, there would be no way to have any concept of tall or short. It's a meaningless concept except for in relationship. And so yin yang is really trying to identify that there's this relationship between things that really gives definition to what they are. And part of what we're trying to understand then when we are thinking about our experience in the world of presence, in the world of 10,000 things, is how they relate to each other and how do we work to try and bring about a certain amount of harmony or balance within the system. Now, that was kind of a lot to chew on, but this is at the core of how that Taoist philosophy works and what the ultimate goal is in terms of how do we live in harmony with it. If we want to try and, again, take this into some kind of modern day context, if we think of something like gravity, we can say, okay, this is a law of nature or rule of physics that we can be ignorant of. And if we want to try and do something, say like flying, and we don't pay attention to gravity, if we don't learn about gravity, we're never going to make any progress. But only when we work in harmony with this existing pattern, this gravity concept, only then are we able to become successful at learning how to fly. It's not that it's not possible to fly, but it requires that we understand how things work in order to bring that about. And this is really kind of what they're saying is the more we work in harmony with things, then the easier it's going to be for our life to experience it as thriving, as flourishing. And this is really the goal, is finding that balance, finding that harmony. And all the rest of this we'll get into much more detail when we get into the various chapters of the Daodejing and it starts to flesh out these different concepts. But this will give us at a very high level this conceptual framework that there's the Tao, the way of things, the way of everything in this context. And when we're thinking about everything, it's really kind of like two different aspects of without form and with form that go back and forth into each other. That within that form, or when absence becomes presence, we have that yin-yang mutual co-relative attributes about things that we want to try and work towards understanding what that balance looks like, and that our actions within this context are working to bring about balance or harmony so that we can have a more fulfilling life. I hope you've enjoyed this particular episode of Kinship Cafe. If you would like to know more about what we're doing, you can go to our website, which is kinship.cafe, and there you can register for our email where you will get these videos as they come out each week, and you will get an invitation to participate in the live presentation of this material, either on a Zoom presentation that we do on Friday mornings or in person on Sunday mornings if you happen to be in the Southern California area. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And look forward to seeing you next time. Be well.